I'm Ryan Davis,
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
and this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
The seat taken.
Hey.
Ryan, how much do you like it when you go check your mail every
I love it when I'm expecting a check.
day? Who's sending you checks?
Some clients still like to pay by check.
Really? They pay with paper?
Yeah, we'll have their bank issue it, but yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Checks through the mail are a very dangerous proposition. Definitely recommend. Well, are we being sponsored by the Cash App yet?
No, my mom sometimes sends me like really heavy things that can't possibly make any sense to send.
Aw.
Like she'll send like a bag of flour. It's like, like, all right.
Does she know the last time her son baked something?
I don't know what she imagines I use the flour for, but
Well, the reason I asked that, Ryan, is because today we are featuring an awesome interview that I did with the director of a Smithsonian museum. It's the National Postal Museum. Postal Museum covers topics from stamps perfect for stamps collectors, got the history of the Postal Service, and I'll tell you what, the history of the Postal Service, I'm convinced, is the history of our country.
I can understand that argument. I mean, having the ability for the same price to send a letter to somebody in one of the far off states was really did something to make the country small when we were being founded.
Absolutely. I mean, I hope you're not joking because
I'm not joking.
No, the Postal Service truly is an unbelievable, amazing innovation.
I feel like you and I would have been part of the Pony Express, don't you? Like we would have been out there, we would have been on the desk. We would have been scheduling.
Yeah, we would have been sending the ponies out. Yeah. And in the interview, we cover some of the best parts of the museum. I think introduce a museum that not enough people know about. My major selling point for it is if you are going in and out of Union Station in Washington, D.C., this is the Smithsonian Museum that is absolutely closest to the station. And so I'm excited to bring it to you and get you excited for one of America's national treasures, the National Postal Museum. And here's my interview with the director, Elliot Gruber.
It's time to take off and meet Elliot.
Ryan, neither snow, nor rain, nor heat, nor gloom of night is going to keep us from this interview. Tell the cabin crew.
Cabin crew, it's time to take off.
Flight attendants, prepare for takeoff, please.
Well, I am joined today by Elliot Gruber, the director of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum in Washington, D.C. Elliot, thank you so much for joining us on Out of Office.
Thank you very much for having us. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
So you'll notice when I mentioned the museum that you head, I did say Smithsonian, right? So people know, okay, there's a Smithsonian National Museum system, primarily based in D.C. I think they probably think the spaceships, the airplanes, the Natural History Museum. Why don't you tell us, what can people find at the National Postal Museum?
Well, I think, it dates back to when I was hired about a year and a half ago. I think the Smithsonian recognizes the fact that there are some signature museums among our network of 18 museums. As you mentioned, Air and Space Museum, the National Museum of American History, the National Museum of Natural History, the recently opened museum for the National Museum of African American History and Culture. Mm-hmm. But how do you make sure that the general public, both here domestically and overseas, understand that there are many other museums, including the National Postal Museum? Most people think when they hear of the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, do people still use stamps anymore? Or I'm not interested in postal history.
Right.
And I think what really takes people by surprise is that really the National Postal Museum reflects the history and development of our country. The Colonial Post was started in 1775 by Ben Franklin. Huh. Most people are aware of Ben Franklin, right?
Yeah, that gives you credibility enough.
Yeah, exactly. They think of the kite and the key, and he did something else. Right. And so he was the first Postmaster General of the Colonial Post, which became the United States Postal System. Mm-hmm. But then you think about other aspects of our history. Most people also are familiar with the Pony Express. Well, that delivered mail from the West Coast to back east. Very expensive, by the way. It was almost about $5 back in the 1860s. That's kind of a lot of money back then.
Yeah.
And so
they should mention that anytime they raise the price of stamps today. Put it in context.
I'm not going to go there, but that is factually correct in terms of where we were in the 1800s.
Yeah.
And then even to 1918, most people don't realize that in 1918, the United States Postal Service at the time, started an airmail service.
Hmm.
And that airmail service was actually the launch of the commercial airline industry because in the 1920s, they contracted those services out. And companies like United were
Hmm.
providing mail service, delivering mail, and eventually they started actually delivering people.
Right, right. And I think that was sort of the same with these kind of grand cargo ships, right? That would allow people to travel in the cabins. Often they were hauling mail below, and they could afford people. They could make tickets available to passengers only because the bulk of their cash was coming from the stamps.
That's exactly right. And you have all sorts of stories in terms of, the stagecoaches out west with Wells Fargo, who's carrying mail. And this is another way to actually help with Western expansion, which is also another story that we can tell here at the Postal Museum.
I was so excited to talk about this museum. I visited first in 2013 after there had just been a big renovation of the gross stamp gallery. And I'll tell you honestly what brought me in, which was I was an hour early for a train at Washington D.C.'s Union Station. And you are right next door. The museum is housed, I believe, in the Washington, D.C. main post office, the historic post office, right?
That is correct. It's a Daniel Burnham building built in the 1910s.
So the building itself is something to take in. But I was just blown away thinking, I'll kick around for an hour before going back to New York. And to your point, walking through the museum really brought me through the history, not only of the Postal Service and stamps, but also the history of the United States. And I have to say, I love on your website, one of the things that it describes is it invites people to come to the museum and it says, explore America's postal history and philately from colonial times to the present. And my favorite part about that is that philately sounds like an adverb, but it's not. It's a noun, and it means the collection and study of postage stamps. And so if people take away one thing from this interview, I want them to know that word, philately.
Thank you. That's very important because most people kind of scratch their heads.
Right.
But yeah, I thank you for that very much.
And so you have basically the world's largest collection of philately. 20,000 items are on display with 6 million in the museum's grander collection and holding.
Yeah, that's correct. And so our collection, we have the second largest collection of any Smithsonian museum,
Wow.
with the National Museum of Natural History having the most.
Hmm.
So we have about 6 million items in our collection. And while the bulk of that are stamps, we also have trucks, we have a Segway, we have printing presses, we have all the things associated with the postal history, and that includes the Postmaster General's collection from the United States Postal Service, and that is original artwork for all stamps that have been issued up to a certain point in recent history. We have artwork. We have over 6,000 pieces of art, including several Norman Rockwells. Most people are not aware of that. But the bulk of our collection are stamps. And, so what people think about as the Smithsonian National Postal Museum, so you have all of the stamps from the United States.
Right.
And that is correct. But that's only 20% of our collection.
Right.
So we have 80% of our collection are international stamps.
Huh.
So as you look at the excitement and the possibilities of this institution, is not only can we tell just about any story in American history, because if it's a significant personage, whether it's George Washington or Ben Franklin, Abraham Lincoln, or if it's a discovery or a commemorating, a battle, the natural beauty of the country, all of that has been memorialized in one way or another in stamps.
And of course, I mean, I think we all recognize being featured on a stamp is one of the great honors. I mean, you often quite controversial, and people are vying for that honor in the United States.
Well, and recently there was the Marvin Gaye stamp that was issued just a couple of weeks ago. Actually in next weekend, there'll be a new stamp issued to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the Transcontinental Railroad, which is its completion. And so there'll be a lot of programs in the museum around that.
Is it going to have a golden spike on it?
I can't say,
All right, I'm going to have
I'm
to
not sure
update listeners later.
Yeah, I have seen the stamp, but they do not let me keep the stamp.
All right.
So it's a beautiful stamp.
I'm sure.
But no, I wish I could tell you.
And does the collection get increased today? Like, how do you go about collecting overseas stamps today?
Well, most of that at this point are donated,
Mm-hmm.
and we do have an accessions budget, but we're pretty strategic in terms of what we need, because having 6 million stamps in our collection, we have a lot of the most valuable stamps. So we do not collect, for instance, recent issues from
Right.
other countries.
Okay.
That would just inundate us. Our collection would probably be 100 million stamps.
Yeah, then you'd be on par with the Natural History Museum with all their bone shards and teeth. If you're counting,
Maybe I should collect those. Then.
exactly. If you're counting every little shard as an item, I mean, of course you're going to have the biggest collection.
Yeah, I like that thought. We'll have to talk after.
So let's dive into some of the most historic and significant stamps that folks can see if they come visit the museum. So do you have a penny black, the first postage stamp that ever existed? It was from Britain, 1840, Queen Victoria. Do you have one of those on display?
We do have one of those on display, and it's a very significant stamp, but it's not a particularly valuable stamp because there were so many that were issued.
Mm.
But the interesting note there is that since the first stamps of that nature that we know as stamps that you put on an envelope, since they originated in the United Kingdom, that is the only country that does not put the country's name on its stamp.
Huh. Interesting. Because it was the first. So why would they have to?
Exactly. So France, United States, Russia, everyone else puts the country's name on the stamp except for England.
How interesting. Wow. Well, when we talk about rare and valuable, that might not be that valuable, but I believe what is sort of the most storied stamp, you can see 4 of them if I remember correctly. It is the inverted Jenny. And I remember approaching these. It has sort of the feeling of a religious site, sort of softly lit. It's away from the other stacks and displays of stamps. So tell us the story of what is the inverted Jenny.
So in 1918 was the first year that the Postal Service had airmail delivery. To commemorate that, they issued a stamp. The Jenny was a nickname of a plane. And so it was a 2 printing process. So you had the outline being in one color and the plane being another. So you had very brilliant reds and blues. And so since it was a 2 print process back in 1918, they would send it through one time, and then they would send it through a second. And on one sheet, well, actually about 10 sheets where they realized that they put the plane upside down.
Right.
Quality control
Uh-huh.
caught 9 of those sheets.
Mm.
One sheet of about 100 stamps escaped.
Mm-hmm.
A collector in Washington, D.C. said, there could be potential some errors on this.
Yeah.
Went to a post office, bought a sheet of stamps, saw right away that this sheet of stamps, the plane was upside down, wanted to then buy more.
Mm-hmm.
When the clerk realized it, they said, I need that sheet back. And he said no and left. And he then basically within, I would say, less than 2 months, sold that sheet of 100 stamps, 24 cents per stamp, $24, dollars, or so for a couple $100, he sold it for $15,000,
Right.
which in 1918 is a lot of money.
That's a lot of stamps. Yeah. That's a lot of regular stamps.
Fast forward 100 years later, if you wanted to buy an inverted Jenny stamp, you can. Depending on the quality, it would cost you anywhere from $100,000 to $200,000 or $300,000.
So if you don't manage the museum's finances well, you've got a little insurance in those 4.
Oh yeah, I won't even joke about that. Museums get in trouble. That we do not deaccession those kinds of items.
I don't think that will ever be leaving the collection. I also love one of my favorite items in the collection is not maybe a stamp itself, but it's a wrapping that was used for when the Hope Diamond was entrusted to the Postal Service. I believe it was in 1958. Why don't you tell us that story?
Sure. So Harry Winston, noted jeweler in New York, was sending down the Hope Diamond to become part of the Smithsonian National Museum of Natural History's collection. And so in 1958, he sent via registered mail and insured from New York City, actually to Washington, D.C., to the very building that we're in. It actually arrived here, a package that contained the Hope Diamond. The total package costs about $145, of which roughly $2.50 was represented postage, and the other 140 some odd dollars was insurance for about $1 million.
Yeah. Boy, I'm surprised you didn't need to pay even a little more insurance than that. I mean, you're sending the freaking Hope Diamond.
Well, and so to your point here is that it arrived here. It was escorted down on the mall here in Washington, D.C. to deliver at the National Museum of Natural History. So to date, we actually have the packaging that the Hope Diamond came in, while the Natural History Museum of the Smithsonian has the diamond. And so far, I've not been able to arrange a swap between the two museums.
A swap? I think you should be able to get the diamond for a year with the wrapping, bring them back together, and then the Natural History Museum could have it for a year if you're willing to give up the cover.
I think we can arrange a deal, and maybe you can be our negotiator.
Yeah, absolutely. Are there any other personal favorite stamps that are either on display or that you've had occasion to see that really had a great story behind it or struck something in you?
I think for me, as you think of the general public, what would appeal to them? What are the broader stories that we can tell here? I think people are familiar with the Pony Express, and we have an unbelievable envelope, what they call in the philatelic world a cover, that actually was a letter that was not delivered right away because it turns out that the Pony Express rider was killed along the route. 2 years later, the mailbag was found. And so not only do you have a cancellation of a Pony Express letter, you actually have on the Pony Express, on this letter or on this envelope, you have a handwritten note saying captured by Indians, delivered 2 years later. And
I think you have to add that to the post office code, right? Neither win nor sleet, et cetera, et cetera.
But that's really special. And also in our Gems Gather, we have a stamp that was canceled on the moon. You don't see that every day, and you can actually see some moon dust.
Right.
But if you go beyond stamps, we have interesting stories. Some people will remember, about the anthrax letters that came here. Several postal workers were killed. We actually have a decontaminated anthrax letter in the mailbox that it was mailed from.
Wow.
And that's an important part of our history, just like 9/11. We actually have a number of artifacts from 9/11, including some envelopes that said return to sender undeliverable. Because, of course, the World Trade Towers did not exist, and they had their own zip code.
And don't you also have a destroyed post office box from the World Trade Center site?
Exactly.
I mean, it just goes back to the museum does a great job of bringing out stories of the country, individual stories, moments in history that have been preserved through, post office collateral, whether it be a canceled envelope, whether it be a commemorative stamp.
And that's, I think, the intriguing part, because as you think of the National Postal Museum, I think a motto of ours is to really expect the unexpected.
Yeah.
And most people, and we've seen this on our TripAdvisor ratings. We've seen it on the rankings that we have here as well, that people are very surprised what we have, that we're rated 4.5 stars. We're top 12, 13 of 100 museums in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
And we're kind of a hidden gem.
You are a hidden gem. That's exactly. I'm going to get you that last 0.5 star. Do you know that my podcast ratings are entirely 5 stars, except for one 4.5 rating. So I feel your pain on that. I know what it takes.
All right. Well, hopefully I'm not sending us back a little bit.
Well, I think the key to that last 0.5 has to be the story of Oni the dog. Okay, so let me set the scene here, which is if you visit the National Postal Museum, you're going along, you're browsing through all these interesting stamps that we've been talking about. And then you go into this corridor and you see what looks like maybe a stuffed animal from afar. And as you approach, you realize it is actually a taxidermied dog wearing a very heavily armored coat. And so I would maybe more of a cape. And so I want you to tell me the story of this particularly jaunty canine.
Well, so Oni was, I would say, kind of a scruffy mutt.
Yeah.
And he was a fairly regular feature up in the Albany, New York post office back in the late 1880s. And I think what I've been told is that he was attracted to the texture or the scent of the mail bags. And so he began riding kind of some of the mail wagons, and then actually started riding some of the mail trains, the railway trains, because around that time frame in the 1880s and beyond, a lot of the mail was delivered via train. Which, as a side note, if you think of Washington, D.C., you mentioned that we're right next to Union Station. There's a reason for that. The mail was delivered by train to Union Station. Underground, it would come here and be sorted. Penn Station in New York, the Farley Building right next door. So you have a lot of that. So anyway, Oni became a regular feature on the mail trains. And the railway mail service postal workers used to pin some little tokens or badges on him. Eventually, he was weighted down. And so
by all of these trinkets.
Oh yeah, exactly. Because he was this mascot of the railway service, but broadly of the postal service.
And it was if I understand correctly, if he came to your kind of Midwestern town on the mail truck, it was like a minor celebrity was coming to town, and he would be passed from postal worker to postal worker to for his care.
You're exactly right. And John Wanamaker of the Wanamaker department stores out of Pennsylvania heard of this problem of Oni being weighted down. And so basically he had a harness made for him so he could display even some more tags and to make it a little bit less onerous for Oni.
Right. Exactly.
And so he has become a great symbol of the museum, especially as you can imagine for kids and families. And so they want to see Oni.
Yeah, and I remember in the gift shop, I got a great children's book all around Oni and his many travels.
Well, and speaking of his many travels, he actually was sent on a trip around the world as an advertising campaign.
Wow.
And so he actually went off to Asia. So as you're talking about a celebrity, that's not a bad trip to have as a dog.
No, and I'm a little jealous. And I wish I could get him on the travel podcast. I read that by the time he passed on, he had traveled 143,000 miles. So that is admirable by any standard.
Absolutely, and I'm not sure he had a passport.
Right. I think at that time he wouldn't have needed it.
Yeah, probably true. Probably true.
The museum does a great job of displaying how difficult logistically it is to move around all of this mail. And it starts from mailmen's feet. I remember there was you even have a door knocker where I think it was from the early 1910s, where because not everybody at that time was required to have a mailbox, mailmen had to depend on their knuckles to get any attention to put their mail in. And so they started carrying around these sort of wooden hunks so that they could knock with those on doors and really get attention. And it moves from feet to stagecoaches to trains to planes to boats. And you really have lots of pieces of these sorts of vehicles, but you get a sense of just what a logistical challenge and what an extraordinary feat it is that I can put a piece of mail in here in the United States and in the little corner of Boston, Massachusetts, and have it travel literally anywhere in the world, including Antarctica.
Well, and I think that's part of the interesting stories and really the moving stories that we can tell, not only just historically, and I would add bobsleds and other modes of travel.
Right.
But I was just recently at a Heroes Award function where they were honoring current letter carriers and some of the incredible things that they have done to save people, to deliver mail, to get people out of a burning home. And so I think these are part of those stories that really become ingrained in who we are as a people and as a nation. And those are some of the stories that we really want to bring to light for the public. Look at wars. If your loved ones in Iraq or during World War II over in Europe or in Guam, letters were still making it to your loved ones.
Right.
And very important for the troops' morale, as well as for morale on the home front.
Right.
And those are really important stories and moving stories that we can tell. And we are actively collecting some of those letters right now.
And you actually have a few artifacts from the Titanic. How does that connect to the Postal Museum?
Well, as you said, most people are familiar with the ship Titanic,
Mhm.
and the incredible loss of life that occurred back in 1912. What most people don't realize is the Postal Service connection to that story. First, the Titanic's full name was RMS Titanic.
Mm.
What does RMS stand for? Royal Mail Ship.
Right.
Back to a point you made before.
Mhm.
And so there were over 3,000 sacks of mail on the Titanic. There were 5 postal workers, 2 British, 3 U.S. Since the ship sailed from the UK heading toward New York, the 2 British postal clerks were in charge of sorting and getting the mail ready for delivery here in the U.S. And conversely, the U.S. Postal clerks were going to do the same on the return voyage. And so we actually have a number of artifacts from the Titanic, including a pocket watch from Seapost clerk John Starr March, which is stopped at 1:27 in the morning. And the Titanic sank roughly around 2 a.m. on the morning of April 15th, 1912. So within a half hour of that sinking, this Seapost clerk's watch stopped. The last sighting of the 5 postal clerks was around 12:30 in the morning, and they were trying to rescue some of the registered mail.
Oh my gosh.
And that's the last of anyone ever saw of them, and all 5 perished at sea. And so that's not a story you would expect necessarily to see at the Postal Museum, but we are telling that story just like we're telling Amelia Earhart's story. We have one of her flight suits, not her last flight suit, but we have one of her flight suits.
That would be major news.
That would be, and talking about her relationship with the Postal Service and how she raised money for her expeditions and her flights, which was to carry potentially, say, your letter up for a fee, and you could say, "Hey, Amelia Earhart carried my letter."
Wow. Oh wow. There are still some. So I think I'd probably pay Elon Musk to carry a letter for me for a few days.
Yeah, I would too.
I mean, he blasted into space, though. He'd probably never get it back. I'm not sure they're great on the return yet.
Well, and by the way, there was rocket mail as a test program for the Postal Service.
Well, soon enough, we're going to need that. You're going to need an outpost on the moon.
I think that would be good, and that would be the next story, because we are always looking at the next generation, or what does the future look like? Because as you talk about, we've talked a lot here about the history of the Postal Service. And in the beginning, you can send a person, you could send bees, which you still can right now, and eggs and all sorts of unusual packages.
Yeah.
And think about the fact that, Sears Roebuck, they were sending, houses and everything else through the mail out west.
Right.
And so is that really any different than what Amazon and other major companies are doing now with sending packages to the home? And, where does that last mile delivery come from? From the U.S. Postal Service. You order something on Saturday, it comes on Sunday. It's actually the Postal Service that's mostly delivering those packages.
And
so
did I hear correctly? Did you say bees? I can send bees through the mail?
Yes, and actually just a staff person last week in New York City saw a postal a letter carrier carrying a beehive, obviously covered and secured, to a destination.
Wow. That is devotion. See, drones are never going to do that for you. And so is there anything else that you see in the future for the Postal Service, or for the future growth of the Postal Museum?
Well, I think for us, if you look ahead, 2025 is the 250th anniversary of the postal system. 2026 is the 250th anniversary of our country. And so we are here at the Smithsonian National Postal Museum looking at ways to revisit some of the older exhibition experiences in new and more meaningful ways. And so we're seeing what stories we can tell and how to connect more closely with individuals and visitors, not just here at the museum, but also online and across the country.
Mm.
And so, for instance, can we take our artwork of stamps along with the stamps, combining it with the Smithsonian National Portrait Gallery and have portraits large and small? So here's a portrait of somebody that the portrait gallery has. We have the same original artwork and the stamp. And how do we make that travel to art museums around the country and tell these interesting stories to people who cannot make it here to Washington, D.C.?
Yeah, I love too the idea of cross pollination across the Smithsonian network. I know one thing that the Postal Museum has is John T. Jackson's distribution case, and this was a postmaster of Alanthus, Virginia, who took up the post in 1891 and encountered segregation and threats from a community that didn't feel that an African American should hold this position. And he remained in the job for 49 years, retiring in 1940. And so, it's moments like that you could see a cultural connection to, as you mentioned, the newly opened African American Smithsonian Museum. And I think moments like that, all of these things have a deep connection to the post office and to American history more broadly.
And I agree with you 100%. And just on that subject, we actually have a segregated mail bag.
Wow.
And so where mail was segregated between white recipients and black recipients. And that we've been working with the New York Historical Society, and they are taking a show that will include that segregated mail bag on the road. And that is something that most people don't know and never heard of.
I've never heard of that.
That is part of our history. And how do we learn and grow from there?
Right. And maybe we can end on a high note by just talking about you have portraits of some of the most famous stamp collectors and stamp lovers in history. And so, who are some of those famous names?
Well, of course, Franklin Delano Roosevelt,
Sure.
president, an avid stamp collector. He actually even designed some stamps working with the postmaster general. And we have some of his sketches of what he liked to see in some stamp art.
Wow.
We have John Lennon's stamp album on display here. And most people didn't realize that he was a stamp collector. And that we have what we believe are the two earliest known signatures of John Lennon. And that is on display right now at the Postal Museum, along with the recently issued John Lennon stamp.
Wow.
And so we are also just beginning to launch an effort called Conversations in Collecting. And so that we're reaching out to famous individuals that have been or currently still are stamp collectors. And so, but you wouldn't know them as stamp collectors. So we're now having initial conversations with Mark Cuban.
Huh.
Most people didn't realize he's a stamp collector.
No idea.
Janet Yellen.
They must get very sticky in the Shark Tank. You got to pre-lick that back.
Yes, but he has some very interesting stories to tell. But Janet Yellen is another person.
Wow.
We're looking to try to reach out to Ron Woods from the Rolling Stones, and so these are individuals that Dale Chihuly, the famous glass sculptor, does a number of things, including creating original mail art. And so these are people you hear from a different area, but hey, they all have something in common, and that is an interest in history, an interest in stamps and the stories that stamps can tell. And that's another facet of what we can bring to light to most people who say, "Oh, I don't really use stamps, or I don't really know postal history." And then they're like, "Hey, yeah, no, I'd be interested in hearing what Mark Cuban has to say."
Right. Wow. Well, I think the museum itself does a great job of all of that and more. Thank you very much for joining us and for the work you do there. And I hope I can get you that last 0.5 star. You guys deserve it.
Thank you very much, and I hope to see you at the museum and your listeners at the museum sometime soon.
Absolutely. Give Oni a pat for me.
You got it.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, this is the last stop on this train. Everyone, please leave the train.
Well, Kiernan, I never thought that the Postal Museum could be so interesting. It's not just about going down to check your mail Monday through Saturday. There's like a
I mean, it's
whole lot
really
going on.
it's very fun to hear about why certain stamps are valuable and
Yeah.
how they've been portrayed. And it's a controversial issue sometimes who you're going to put on a stamp. That's a great place of honor.
Stamps are political.
Stamps are
politics.
political,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
Stamps are politics. That old saying goes, stamps are politics.
So goes the stamp. So goes the nation.
So, Ryan, we got to say thank you to Elliot Gruber for making the time today. I'm sure most of our listeners are right now wrapping themselves into a small package and putting 58 stamps on it. 58, probably 580, so that they can mail themselves down to the National Postal Museum.
Yeah, no, I mean, I've always liked stamps, even as a kid.
Mhm.
And I'm going to have to bring my stamp collection to DC with me next time and just have Elliot walk through each one of them.
Well, I'm sure he's really looking forward to that. All right, Ryan, we are right into the last stop, the last segment of the show, the most popular segment of the show, the people segment. This is where you and I each talk about one thing that we've read, seen, tasted, cooked, visited that week to keep the spirit of travel alive within us, to feed the spirit of wanderlust. So, Ryan, I got to ask, what's your last stop this week?
So, Kiernan, I was lucky enough to catch a screening of the new Ralph Fiennes film called The White Crow. And The White Crow is about a dancer named Rudolph Nureyev. And I'm butchering his last name.
I'm sure it's exactly right.
Yeah. He was a dancer in the early 1960s who was one of the top ballet dancers in Russia. And when he flew to Paris to make the first sort of the dance organization sort of post-war sort of presentation in Paris, he was supposed to spend a month there. He actually decided to stay and he defected to live in France. And what's beautiful about the film is that they got to film both in Paris and in Moscow. And it is just stunning because there's a ton of dance in it. But also they really film around some of these fantastic buildings in Paris. And we were just talking recently about Notre Dame. And, another thing I didn't do when I was in Paris was go to the ballet.
What were you doing when you were in Paris? Sounds like you didn't do much. So you haven't been, but did you feel that this movie kind of takes you there?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it takes you back to the 1960s in Paris, which is super exciting. They go to all these cabarets, they go to jazz clubs. They spend a lot of time, obviously, in dance. He goes to the Louvre, and it's really sort of you're getting to see Paris through this young dancer's eyes, who's been in sort of cold communist Russia his whole life, and doesn't get to go to Paris till he's like in his early 20s for the first time. So it really got me excited about going to Paris again, and wanting to do these things that I have not done in my time visiting Paris. So yeah, so the film is it's incredibly beautiful. It's called The White Crow, and so much of it takes place near the Opera Nationale de Paris, which is the beautiful building in Paris where the ballet and the opera both are. So maybe want to take a trip.
And I'm giving you Rick Steves, absolutely, because it's time that you did the basics, because you just keep skipping them every time you go to Paris.
I know. I've only done like the food nightlife, so you got to get me into the culture of Paris.
Absolutely, obscure museums of Paris. Here you come.
What is your last stop this week, Kiernan?
Ryan, I got a new traveler's badge of honor this week. I was digging into. I subscribe to Bon Appetit. I like food and I like to cook, so I subscribe to Bon Appetit. And it is their travel issue. And they have a featured restaurant from Peru that is a new restaurant that I am proud to say I visited, tracked down when it was in its earliest days, and it is called Mil, M-I-L. And I feel like, it's just nice to have the verification that, Kiernan, you know what you're doing when you're booking that travel. All that planning really counts for something because Bon Appetit verifies.
Now you have definitely pointed me in the right direction on several restaurants. Both overseas and in New York. You keep up somehow with what's happening in the New York.
I
food
do a
scene.
lot of reading. So what's spectacular about Mil is that it's about an hour and a half car ride outside of Cusco. So you're committing your entire afternoon to heading out there. But Mil is built above Incan ruins. And what it is it's these concentric circle terraces. And what archaeologists believe these terraces were used for was testing how to grow best different types of crops at different altitude. Because You're in the Sacred Valley of Peru. Even just feet of difference can create different types of microclimates, some of which will be better for growing types of corn, certain types of potatoes. And this is where the Incans actually did that experimentation. So what better way to enjoy the view of those ruins, which I will, of course, post at our Instagram at OOO Podcast, than to take in a delicious meal that is all about Peruvian ingredients.
That sounds fantastic. And I actually love when I'm on vacation to go to a restaurant that is sort of out of the way and that you actually leave the city for. So this sounds like a place I would most definitely check out.
I can say, with no exaggeration, this is the best meal I've ever had in my life.
That's
It was the most interesting. It was so of a place. This was destination dining at its very best. And what's very cool about the facility is it's a quite small building, and a full half of it is a laboratory and research center where they are working with the local communities to save all different types of vegetable and produce that is native to Peru. So, one example from this article is there are 4,000 different types of potatoes in Peru. There are also hundreds and hundreds of varietals of corn. And what this meal does is it gives you just a little bit of a taste of how different vegetables can be than from what you and I are used to. So they even have a whole dish. It's called a diversity of corn, and it's all different types of flavors, colors, and sizes of corn.
I love that. I'm imagining you subscribing to another food monthly package of different kinds of corn.
Oh my gosh, I would be the first
Yeah.
one. Sadly,
Yeah.
I don't think it travels as well.
Yeah,
but
or the Irish in us would definitely want to have those monthly potato deliveries.
meal was started by a brother-sister team, the Martinez siblings, and I would love to try to get them on the show because, as I say, this is absolutely worth the wait. You all, if you should go to Peru, and we are working on an episode of for Peru very soon. Meal will be very highly featured in that. So Meal and the Bon Appetit travel issue on stands now.
Well, great. What are we talking about next week, Kiernan?
We are talking about the challenges and thrills of planning and executing driving overseas.
So, what happens if you don't have Wi-Fi and you need to call an Uber? Or, what do you mean by driving?
No, some of us like to get behind the wheel, Ryan. We like to
Oh my
rev
God.
that engine. We like to, click open those child locks.
Yeah, but what you don't know is that sometimes you sit on the different side. Sometimes,
Hey, save
sometimes
what-
you have to drive in reverse the entire time. It's very complicated.
Well,
out there.
I don't know what countries you're thinking of, but Ryan, save all that thought for next time when we talk about driving overseas.
And until next time, I'm Ryan Davis,
And I'm Kiernan Schmidt.
and this is Out of Office, a travel podcast.
This seat taken.
I think you should collect stamps.
Yeah, I know, but do I really have time for another weird hobby?
Oh,
I don't know.
I think you do.
I'm listening to Star Wars podcasts. I got
Oh,
these
God.
national park posters. Can I really afford stamps? Poor Catherine.